My name is Adam Biggs, and I am a faculty over at the University of South Carolina Lancaster campus in the African American Studies Department. Bobby Donaldson was slated to moderate this panel, but he had another competing obligation in Savannah, and he asked me if I could step in. So he sends his regrets. I think we have a very interesting and exciting sort of panel coming up here on slave insurrections, slave rebellions, that is, as a form of insurrection. And I think it's interesting because in a lot of ways, I don't think slave rebellions are often characterized or contextualized in that same sort of historical context. So it's interesting to see how this is going to get put up against the narratives that we've already been seeing in a context of military history.
Yeah, I thought about this a fair bit. I mean, I've done quite a lot of work on the Stoner Rebellion, but I hadn't really sort of conceptualized it as an insurgency, so the invitation to give this talk was quite helpful for me. So what I'm going to do essentially is tell you about the Stoner Rebellion and then make some remarks about whether or not we can conceive of it as potentially successful, and then make also some suggestions about why it failed. Now, slave revolts, I think, by definition, quite complicated things, and I think the Stoner Rebellion is no exception, which perhaps explains why historians are still drawn to the topic. Most recently, Peter Hoffer and Jack Schuler have treated the Stoner Rebellion following on the heels of distinguished historians such as Peter Wood and John Thornton and Edward Pearson. So it's very much an alive topic. And part of the reason for that continued interest is because the evidence, as you would expect with the slave revolt of this nature, isn't complete. The Stono insurrectionists left few clues, really, indicating why and how they revolted, and most of the evidence comes to us secondhand from white sources, and they disagree on fundamental issues. Even sort of very basic facts are annoyingly elusive. And David just asked me, he says, well, where do you peg the numbers for this revolt? And there's 100, 80, 120, it depends who you read. There's no sort of agreed upon consensus. How many died in this revolt? We don't really know. How many whites were killed? Well, we can make guesses. When did the revolt start exactly? Was it late on September the 8th? Or was it on September the 9th? And for reasons I'll explain in a moment, I think the dating is important. How long did it last? Don't really know exactly. So assessing the nature and meaning of this slave revolt is even more complicated since there are interpretations embedded. At first blush, this Stono Rebellion is a contradiction. It's an event framed in binaries. The rebels were bloodthirsty and brutal, yet rational and discriminating. They cut off white heads even as they used their minds. The revolt was at once intensely local, yet deeply connected to the larger developments of the Atlantic world. The participants were at once Congolese Africans, but also influenced by Portuguese Catholics. They fought as soldiers, but they prayed as Christians. Some were loyal to their masters, others loyal to their cause. The event was timed precisely, yet hobbled by accident and chance, and the list could go on. But in some important respects, the meaning of the Stoner Rebellion is best understood not by trying to flatten these binaries, but by treating them as reliable indicators of the complicated and textured multivalent world in which the slaves lived and in which white South Carolinians lived too in 1739. Now, I do think that this insurgency could have succeeded. And in fact, on its own terms, it probably wasn't far from succeeding in a certain way. And I'll say a few words about that. But ultimately, I want to dedicate most of my comments about why it didn't succeed. Let me contextualize this revolt first. The Stoner Rebellion occurred in a decade noted for slave unrest. The 1730s was marked by slave unrest throughout the New World plantation complex. Conspiracies were uncovered in the Bahamas in 1734, Antigua a year later, Jamaica 1739, and as part of the Atlantic system, South Carolina likewise experienced unrest and discontent among its slave population. Enslaved people throughout the New World were rejecting bondage and either running away to or fighting for liberty. And sometimes, as they did at Stono, they did both at once. The Stono Rebellion was an en masse escape to freedom, and in that process it entailed fighting for freedom. Regardless of their location, slave rebels used similar strategies and tactics to achieve their ends. They appropriated forms of punishment and violence whites used with slaves, such as beheading. In slave hands, decapitation became a direct challenge to white authority, an inversion of customary power relations. Arson was also common, both in the Caribbean and on the North American mainland, as a means of destroying slaveholders' property, which of course example of property attacking property, and as a mechanism for alerting potential rebels to the act of insurrection. This wasn't just a southern story, there was no south as such, there were southern colonies, and you can find similar developments happening outside of the southern colonies. Did the slaves who conspired to revolt in New York City in 1741, those on the Danish island of St. John in 1733, those slaves and Irish workers who conspired to burn Savannah in 1738. The Stono rebels in 1739, did they act with knowledge of one another's revolts? Hardly. I suspect that communication networks, while they did exist, were not anywhere near as evolved amongst the dispossessed to have that kind of currency. But still, the conspiracies and revolts of the period are, I think, understood, at least in part, by attending to the Atlantic experiences of the conspirators and by understanding the possible connections between them. And I don't think the Stono Rebellion can really be properly understood without attention to that context. Now, the Stono slaves sought to escape and establish autonomy rather than initiate revolutionary upheaval, and their actions were guided by these transatlantic connections to some extent. And the revolt itself influenced not just the political, economic and social future of South Carolina's slaveholding society, but also became part of a much larger imperial struggle between England and Spain, a struggle that centered over control and the stability of the southeastern part of North America. It is worth remembering that a century before antebellum slaves looked north to freedom, they looked south to Spanish promises of liberty for those slaves who escaped to Spanish Florida before the Revolution. Slaves in South Carolina had been running to northern Spanish Florida for years, and the Stono Rebellion continued this practice. The revolt was an en masse act of escape and a genuine insurrection replete with international implications. The War of Jenkins' Ear between England and Spain broke out in late 1739 and lasted until 1748, and South Carolinians' convictions that the Spanish had been instrumental in fomenting the slave revolt led them to support an attack on Florida mounted by Oglethorpe in 1740. So I think the Stono Rebellion is very much embedded in that larger conversation about imperial tensions in the southeast. What actually happened in the revolt? My research and others' research gives a story that follows something like this. For weeks, possibly months, slaves in the low country of South Carolina had learned, courtesy of emissaries and spies from Spanish Florida who had been spotted in Charleston. Some people say they saw one, perhaps two, that if they fled to St. Augustine and converted to Catholicism, that they would be considered free. This offer, as I've suggested, formed part of a Spanish imperial effort to destabilize the English colony of South Carolina, and so the prospect of liberty was the lure and the immediate cause of the rebellion. I think that the slaves initially met at night on Saturday, September the 8th, and the revolt began early on Sunday, September the 9th, 1739. Early that morning, the conspirators, and we don't really know how many there were, between 80 and 120 is my best guess, met at the Stono River in St. Paul's Parish. From there, they moved on to Stono Bridge, and having stolen guns from a local store, killed 5 whites, burned a house, and continued southward. They headed towards Florida. Before sunup, the rebels reached a tavern. They spared the innkeeper, a apparently they believed the innkeeper to be a kind master, but they killed his neighbours and burned 4 of their houses. At this point, we know that other slaves in the vicinity joined the rebellion and enlarged the group. That's perhaps why some suggestions are in the 100-120 region. And they were seen banging drums and holding aloft some kind of banner. Now, by pure chance, so the story goes, Lieutenant Governor William Bull and 4 companions were on their way back from Granville County, and they encountered the insurgents at about 11 o'clock in the morning. According to Bull's account, by this point the rebels had slain 20 whites and they were headed towards Georgia, killing and burning as they went. Now, courtesy of their horses, Bull and his companions escaped and alerted the militia and local planters. In the meantime, the rebels continued southward. They stopped in a field, which was called the battlefield, near Jacksonboro Ferry. By this time, it was late afternoon, and the original insurgents had covered about 10 to 15 miles. Some were tired in this field, others apparently were drunk, and for whatever reason, they paused, and they decided not to cross the Edisto River just yet. It was at this point, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that Bull's men and the militia, about 100 of them, caught up with the Stono rebels. And this was their pitched engagement. And the rebels, by white account, fought well and bravely, but the armed militia won the fight at the battlefield. In the midst of battle, about 30 insurgents escaped, many of whom were hunted down in the days and weeks that followed. Planters released the slaves they believed had been coerced to join the rebellion. Those they considered willing insurgents they shot. They decapitated a few of them and set their heads on posts as a grisly warning. And echoes of the revolt lingered. On the following Sunday, a week later, militiamen encountered a group of disbanded rebels about 30 miles south of the battlefield, where a second battle ensued. Even though this fight ended the revolts, whites remained cagey and jittery, and militia companies were on guard, and a few planters left the region entirely fearing that not all the rebels had been rounded up. And they were right to concern. The last leader of the group was finally captured in 1742. White authorities dealt with the revolt in 2 ways, and I think both are revealing of just how significant they thought the revolt was. First of all, they rewarded slaves who, in their estimation, had remained loyal to whites during the rebellion. In the longer term, the rebellion led South Carolina authorities to introduce, according to one historian, a fundamental alteration in the character of Carolina society, with a less open and compromising slave system. Specifically, the insurrection, the Stoner Rebellion, resulted in the 1740 Negro Act, which, among many other things, made patrol service mandatory for militiamen. In an attempt to slow the growth of South Carolina's black majority population, authorities also introduced a prohibitive duty on the importation of new slaves, which went into effect in 1741. The duty doubled the price of slaves, not only in an effort to limit the number of Africans in the colony, but to provide revenue to encourage the immigration of white European settlers there. The measures were not especially successful. Although few Africans were brought to South Carolina in the 1740s, just over 50,000 came between 1750 and the American Revolution, and by 1775 almost 60% of South Carolina's population was black. Now, clearly the Stoner Rebellion not only resulted in closer surveillance of slaves, but increased responsibilities of masters that, ironically enough, imposed on their own liberties. The legislation of 1740 took away an important right held by masters, the right to manumit their own slaves, and that authority was now placed in the hands of the state. Tensions with the Spanish, the challenge to stability and order posed by the Great Awakening, difficulties with Indians, and the events at Stono, according to historian Robert M. Weir, combined to produce an unprecedented willingness on the part of local leaders to compromise and cooperate. In other words, the Stoner Rebellion helped glue white society in the face of slave society. The revolt cost about 20 white lives and about 40 black. Now, evaluation. This revolt could have succeeded, I suppose, and in a way it wasn't far from succeeding. The rebels did have outside assistance of some sort. First of all, they had informational assistance, which came from the Spanish. Secondly, and I think perhaps more importantly in a way, they had a kind of cultural or inspirational assistance. They were fighting for a cause, and they were fighting for two causes, both of which were emotionally, I think, quite important. The first is that they were fighting for a religious conviction at some level. Bear in mind that the Spaniards had offered freedom to those slaves who made it to St. Augustine and converted to Catholicism. Well, it seems to me, and some historians agree with me, that many of these slaves involved in the Stoner Rebellion were already Catholic, courtesy of Portuguese influence in West Africa. And if you trace the influence, you can see quite clearly that many of these slaves were not only exposed to Catholicism in the Congo, but they embraced Catholicism to the point where they knew their liturgy, they knew their Catholic calendar. And that's why I think the date of the revolt is quite important. They meet on September the 8th, 1739, which is the Nativity of Mary. I don't think it's coincidental. And the reason I say that is because, according to some accounts, the rebels were heard calling not just liberty, but Mary. And they had banners, white banners, that in the Congo they had also used to celebrate Marian imagery and Catholicism. So I think there's a heavy dose of religion here. And religion, as we well know, can be inspirational as a source of insurgency. Secondly, and relatedly, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberty. And this point was made quite clearly in a report of the committee appointed to inquire into the causes of the late expedition against St. Augustine 2 years after the revolt. And this report said very simply, in September 1739, our slaves made an insurrection at Stono in the heart of our settlement. The number was in a manner equal on both sides, that is to say, the white contingent was roughly equal to the black contingent during their engagement at the battlefield. And an engagement ensued, such as may be supposed, in such a case wherein one fought for liberty and life, the other for their country and everything that was dear to them. In other words, there was a recognition that these slaves were fighting for something meaningful, liberty and life. The others were fighting for their country and everything dear. In other words, it was an emotional, inspirational, meaningful event. I think also, if John Thornton is right, and I think he is right, that at least some of these slaves, and perhaps very many of them, weren't your average slaves. They were soldiers in the Congo. They had military experience. They were recognized as soldiers. And the accounts of the engagement at battlefield by whites talk quite glowingly of the military skill with which these slaves fought. I think there was a kind of grudging appalling of that skill in actual fact. So they had potential. I mean, they had some military experience. Now, why did it fail? I think it's fairly obvious. I think that the militia was better armed. They also had horses, which the slaves didn't. And in fact, the planters in the vicinity tended to be armed anyway. Already on the statute books was a law requiring planters at church on Sundays to be armed at church. Which explains why Bull could collect a sufficient number of whites and the militia quickly enough to get them to the battlefield. So there were a significant military force tending to this slave revolt. Another reason, often overlooked by historians, why this revolt did not work, is the simple fact of chance and accident. William Bull just simply happened to encounter these slave rebels. And I realize that our postmodern moment likes to talk about the importance of structure and certainty at a certain level, but chance happens, accidents happen, and they were unlucky. Had they not been exposed, or had Bull not run into them, the chances are they might have got further, and perhaps into Georgia. After that, who knows what would have happened. I mentioned the presence and significance of external force, and that certainly is true, but obviously it was insufficient. All the Spaniards did was provide them with information, but with no real assistance, no material assistance. And without that assistance, I think that the Stono slave rebels were never going to succeed. I think there's a very simple point too, that the distance between South Carolina and Charleston and St. Augustine is a bit of a trek. It's about 230 miles as the crow flies. It's not a small distance, and it's certainly quite difficult terrain to navigate. It was asking quite a lot of slave rebels. Having said that, of course, people had been doing it for years, but in ones and twos, not in groups. The story was passed down through oral culture. It became embedded in African American culture in South Carolina. People knew about it. Slaves, or former slaves rather, who were interviewed in the 1930s, not only remember the Stono Rebellion, they remember the day it happened, they remember the numbers, or roughly the numbers, they remember the chance encounter that William Bull has. In other words, if we take an expansive definition of success, in a society in which slave culture was not encouraged, often denied, then I think perhaps we can see the Stono Rebellion as having a kind of cultural legacy that, while did not lead to freedom, certainly did not lead to the enslavement of the spirit. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank Captain Lee for the invitation to be here, particularly as my topic is probably the most extraneous of all those on the programme. My general unfamiliarity with this area of study, you will notice from the complete absence of acronyms in my paper. That's one of the other things as well. I'll be talking about the revolution that created Haiti out of the French colony of Saint-Domingue. And for those of you who don't know, Saint-Domingue was not just the wealthiest colony in the Caribbean at the end of the 18th century. In some ways, it was the most productive export economy in all the Americas. At the time the revolution broke out in the 1790s, it was the world's major producer of sugar and coffee and other tropical products. It exported more than the United States, far more than Mexico and Brazil, and that gives it a claim to fame simply as regards the location where it took place. Its other claims to fame, though, are it's by far and away the largest of slave rebellions that took place in modern times. It's often said to be the only successful one, and it really begins the 100-year process whereby slavery was eradicated from the Americas. And it's the only instance where slave resistance was clearly the major factor, causal factor in that eradication. So the 15-year revolution that transformed the French colony of Saint-Domingue into the independent state of Haiti included several episodes that might be classed as insurgencies, but by far the most important was the slave uprising that began in August 1791 in the colony's northern plain and led to the abolition of slavery in Saint-Domingue 2 years later. In magnitude, duration, and outcome, the 1791 slave uprising was more or less unique in world history. Although the number of insurgents is impossible to estimate, roughly 100,000 enslaved people lived in the region that the insurgents intermittently controlled for 2 years. To find slave rebellions of comparable size or duration, one has to go back to Roman Sicily in the 2nd century BC or to early medieval Iraq. Caribbean history witnessed more than a dozen slave insurrections. This stark contrast between the Caribbean and the rest of the Americas regarding the size and incidence of slave rebellions can be attributed primarily to two related factors. First was the ratio of enslaved to